everyone. My name is Deborah Griffith, and I am the S&T archivist. And this is Katie Seal, walk into frame, Katie. And she is the State Historical Society's Rolla Research Center archivist. We are both located in the basement of this building, so if you have any history questions, we're a great resource for everybody in the area. I'd like to welcome you all to the second in our series of talks, 3 talks, about different aspects of World War I. These talks coincide with our jointly produced Smithsonian poster exhibit, World War I Lessons and Legacies, which is over in the back of the room, and it also contains artifacts from the U.S. Army Engineer Museum, which is located at Fort Leonard Wood. If you get a chance and you can get through the gates, go see it. It's a wonderful museum complex. Okay, tonight's talk is going to be live streamed on Facebook, and it'll be on the S&T Archives Facebook page. We're also going to save it there, so if you want to go look at it in the future, you'll be able to see it again. So tonight we'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Biological Sciences Professor Dr. David Westenberg. Dr. Westenberg has received numerous awards for teaching and advising, including the 2020 ASM Karski Award, the Class of 42 Alumni Excellence in Teaching Award, and the Alumni Outstanding Advisor Award from the Alumni Association, the Distinguished Advisor Award from Missouri S&T Student Life, and the 2017 Science Educator Award from the Academy of Sciences. He is a Missouri S&T Dean's Teaching Scholar, the National Academy of Science Education Fellow in Life Sciences. Earlier this year, he was the Outreach Director for another Smithsonian exhibit called Outbreak, Epidemics in a Connected World, which you may have seen at the center. So anyways, whew, please welcome Dr. Westenberg.
Oh, thank you for the very kind introduction. Yes, I earlier this year, kind of in a similar, 1918 being the 100th anniversary of the World War I. There was an exhibit at the Smithsonian to commemorate what I'm going to talk about today, the 1918 flu pandemic. And so there's an exhibit available, and if anyone wants to display that somewhere in the community, let me know. It's stored at the Kaleidoscope Discovery Center, and lots of accessories that go along with it. So I'd be happy to talk to someone about displaying that exhibit. So my topic today is lessons from this great influenza and public health. So my background is I am a microbiologist. I am not a historian, despite what some of the questions that might come along. But I love the history of microbiology. It's a fascinating story, especially when you look at what I call the golden age of microbiology, which was just before this pandemic. And so I'm going to try and connect some of those ideas and how our healthcare system was prior to this point and how it was impacted by the lessons learned from this great pandemic. Because this is really the first time where a natural disaster really impacted the science as it was developing at that time. So I think there's a great story that can come from this. So that's where I want to go with my presentation. And so let's go back to 1917 and think about what the world was like back at that time period. We were just getting into the war in 1917. We heard a little bit about this last week from Petra DeWitt about some of the stories that were going around that time and how society responded to this war effort. In 1917 April, we entered the war, and then in June, a call for a draft because there weren't enough people to serve in the war. So this was a war where people were needed. And people wanted to participate. They wanted to get involved and try and see what they could do to help the war effort. And so let's take a step back into a small town in southwestern Kansas, Catskill County. Like any other small community, young men were interested in supporting the war effort, were drafted into the war effort, and so they go off to train and get ready for the war. So I love this description from John Barry's The Great Influenza, and as I said, I'm not a historian, so a lot of my material comes from a wonderful book from John Barry. If you really want to see how healthcare evolved at the turn of the century, It's a great story about the mindset of what was going on at that time period. But yeah, this great description of what small town Kansas was like back in the days. Very small population, covered a broad area. And so this is where a lot of the men going off to war were coming from. And so there's some stories that go along with it. Fort Funston was a facility at Fort Riley. And so this is where a lot of the soldiers went for their training. And Haskell County was close by, so this is the location where the soldiers would go for their training periods. And so all the Army personnel from this region went to Funston. And of course in early 1918, people started noticing the outbreak of influenza, but nothing unusual. That's what happens in February, March, anywhere in the world. You're going to see an increase in incidences of the influenza. And so nothing particularly unusual at this time period, or so we thought. So in early February, people started noticing and reporting in the local paper that there were some outbreaks happening. Typical stories you see in a small town paper. Everybody suffering from La Grippe or pneumonia. But also describing, the people back from on furlough or traveling to visit a family member in the fort. So a lot of quaint stories from our small community described in this booklet. Okay, but at the same time as the soldiers going off to war, the influenza followed along. So shortly after these soldiers started arriving in Funston, they started noticing an outbreak of this flu-like illness. Early March, shortly after this time period when a lot of these movements were going. And within a short period of time, a number of soldiers got ill, and within weeks, it quintupled. So a very dramatic increase in the incidence. But that's not surprising when you look at how soldiers are housed during this time period. A lot of close contact, a lot of opportunities for microbes to be spread. So not a huge surprise at this time of year. Fortunately, nothing serious came about from this early incidence, this early February, March outbreak of the influenza. So let's put this in perspective then. What our public health system was like at this time period, what was their preparation for an outbreak that is yet to come. Okay? So one thing about public health in 1918 is that public health was for the elites. There was a lot of separation of who was accessible to healthcare. Only the elite had access to a lot of the healthcare. And there was certainly a lot of elitism that goes along with this idea that the workers, the poor, were actually to blame for their own healthcare issues. The ideas were that the wealthy blamed others for their sickness, that they didn't take care of themselves. It was their own fault that they got sick. So that was one of the attitudes about the community in response to these types of things, that we don't get sick, they get sick, and then they cause us to get sick, type of attitude. There was really no standard for healthcare. What people had access to. Doctors were pretty much independent contractors. I love some of the stories about the doctors in this time period. Their territory was the county. One doctor went off and visited the old doctor doing his house calls. That was what life was like at this time period. And of course, infectious disease was a foreign concept in many ways. There were some diseases that were well known, like mumps, chickenpox, measles, that they reported to the healthcare authorities to let them know what might be coming down the road, because these were well-known concerns for the community. But there was really little mechanism to communicating that there's a problem. And so things were ripe so that if something happened, that there may be a high risk that things could get out of control before anybody was able to respond to what's happening. So that's what public health was like in this time period. And I should let you know, anytime you have questions, you want me to say anything, respond to anything, just blurt it out. I'm happy to stop anywhere along the way. I do tend to sometimes talk a little bit fast, so you can also kind of get me to slow down by asking me a question. All right. Anything else you want to know about 1918 and our healthcare system as it prepares for this outbreak? Okay. So, is the healthcare system ready? Let's look at what the science was like at this time period. This isn't that long after the discovery that microorganisms cause disease. We can go back and look in 1850s. John Snow, no, not that John Snow, a different John Snow. This was John Snow, the physician, who solved a cholera outbreak in London, famous for the Broad Street pump, where he realized that it was the source of an outbreak of cholera. The story is he went out late at night, took the handle off the Broad Street pump, and saved the city of London. Of course, that's just a story, but it makes for a nice story, so I'll still keep it to it. But people were realizing that infectious diseases could be spread by things like water. In that time period, people thought bad air was the cause, something called miasma. You smell bad air, that's what makes you sick. It's not something that you get from contact with people or drinking water. It's the air around you that makes you sick. But people were starting to realize that, oh, there's something else behind this. And then in 1882, Robert Koch was the scientist, the microbiologist that really put microorganisms on the map by identifying the causative agents of diseases like tuberculosis, anthrax. He had the skills and ability to actually demonstrate that this organism was linked to this particular disease. So now people recognize there are organisms out there that can cause disease, these things we call bacteria. And not long after that, we discovered viruses could cause disease. And so now we have people actually recognizing that there are these things they call filterable poisons that could now cause disease. So healthcare was aware of there are agents that can be in our water, in our people, in our foods that can lead to illness. So a very scientific approach to what was then a very complex issue. So our healthcare system from that perspective was well prepared. You know, if an outbreak happens, we have an idea of what might be the potential causes, and we might have some strategies to try and protect it. In the late 19th century, around this time when all these discoveries were happening in Europe, Europe was realized that healthcare, that medicine should be a scientific process. Up until then, medicine was an art. You know, it wasn't something that was based on scientific data. It was based upon, you know, stories and ideas that they might have about how to treat an illness, but not knowing what really the cause of this what this might have been. I found it interesting, a quote in the Great Influenza from 1900, as late as 1900. It was harder to get into, what was the word here, a respectable college than it was to get into a medical school. Described basically anybody could get in medical school if you had a pulse and a feet. You know, you were in medical school. So that's kind of surprising of what our medical practices might have been there. But there were those that were trying to change that. They realized that medicine, because of these scientific advances, that we could take medicine to a level that we could treat illnesses and be better prepared for these kinds of problems. So in the early 1900s, we have things like the Rockefeller Institute of Medical Research, which is now Rockefeller University, Johns Hopkins, University of Michigan. As a Michigan State alum, I hate to say these kind of things, but Michigan was at the forefront of some of these changes in the practices of training medical doctors. So they were trying to change medical education to be a more scientific approach. And so we're starting to see now a movement from the traditional physician to the more scientific physician, and that has an impact on how the influenza outbreak was addressed. Okay. So is the healthcare system ready? Well, we're about to find out. So early on, this is at early 1918, the incidence of flu was nothing out of the ordinary. What we see here are these red bars shows us the time period of typical flu outbreaks. Now, flu's going to happen in February, March, April. That's the typical time when we have the flu. Yes?
So how accurate do you think this data is, and how was it collected?
I have to remember the source of this data. This came from a PBS story. They collected data here. This is the was it death rate per 100,000 population. That's pretty standard. It's data from all over the U.S. This is U.S. data. I should clarify. So I would say this is coming from the Public Health Service. So I'd say it's a pretty accurate. But at the same time, influenza is not a reportable disease. Okay, it's not something that people had to report on. So there's going to be some that are going to be missed along the way. So accuracy from the concept of the absolute numbers, I think, is probably underestimated. But accuracy as far as the trends, I think would be accurate. I'd say that way. Okay. Did I dash that one pretty good? All right. But what we see happening in 1918 is it's no different than what we see in the prior 7 years. Okay? The trends are pretty similar. You might notice that the blue bars from 1918 are a little bit higher in March and April. And that may be a little bit significant at what we're about to see. And from that note, back in Haskell County, the local physician, Dr. Loring Miner, what a great name, right? The Miner saves the day. All right. A local physician who was trained in the older style of medicine, but his approach was more scientific. He wasn't trained in the scientific methods of practicing medicine, but his son was, and he had an interest in this, so he was very keen on collecting data, recognizing what's going on, and he was also aware that when things are unusual, there are outlets to disseminate that information, something called the public health reports produced by the U.S. Public Health Services, which is a precursor to what we see from the Center for Disease Control today called Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. So there's actually a weekly report comes from the CDC on all sorts of situations dealing with morbidity and mortality. And so he actually recognized that this is kind of significant because it wasn't just the number of cases. What he noticed is that it was impacting people much more significantly than a traditional flu outbreak. People were having signs and symptoms that were atypical of the flu. They were having hemorrhagic things. They were bleeding from the nose, things like that. Doesn't happen with the normal flu. Something was suspicious here, but the numbers weren't super high. But he did notice that there was something different, and he thought it was worthy of reporting. So the only report about the flu during this time period was his report to the public health reports. So there was an opportunity there for people to see, but how many people read it, that's the question that we need to ask. Okay. The local paper reported some of these stories, so there's lots of stories about illnesses in the local community, people, suffering from pneumonia, their recovery, all those kinds of stories that are popping up from that. But it's interesting that because this is wartime, and we heard a little bit of this last week about the sequestering of information. Some of it was intentional. There was no rules against reporting on things that might be negative, but the local paper didn't want to hurt morale, so they kind of kept the stories low-key. They weren't going to talk about the deaths and all these things. They wanted to kind of keep a low kill because they want to keep the morale going. So they wanted to kind of keep things more on the positive side of the reports. But it was gone shortly after this outbreak in March until the fall. And that's when things really hit the fan. Okay. Early October, suddenly you see this astronomical increase in the number of flu cases, the severity of flu cases, so they recognize now this is serious. Okay, this is something we need to deal with, and how do we deal with it? So that's the situation we're going to have. This is the pandemic that we're all greatly concerned about. So how did the public health system respond? Like the good public health systems, we saw some of these stories last week about how we want to sell war bonds and all these different types of things. So the spreading of literature and signs and information was the approach. So setting messages like coughs and sneezes, spread diseases, cough into your shoulder, open your windows, do things outside. I love this. Here's the barbershop outside. Because the idea was that fresh air was going to help you. Because remember, what did people think caused illness? Despite our knowledge of all these things, people still thought bad air made you sick. So if you do things outside, open your windows, then you're going to be better. The one on the right-hand side, that's the University of Montana having physics class outdoors. So I haven't seen any pictures from S&T having classes outdoors in this time period. Been fun to see. But the idea was to open up and get the fresh air in. Of course, then you have cartoons kind of counter to this thing, this great little poem here. I had a little bird. Its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza. So, lots of different cute little pithy stories. I found a little local information from our resources here on campus. In the Rolla Herald, this is the week of October 10th, 1918. Advice on how to deal with the flu. A lot of it has to do with keep yourself from spreading the contagion. Stay home. Don't interact with people. Wash your hands. Avoid crowds. Avoid coughing and sneezing in the on others. Fresh air is always good. Keep your digestive organs in good standing. Drink water freely. Avoid common drinking cups. A lot of just common sense things to avoid this spread of these infectious germs that might cause problems. And then the response also was closing the schools. So a little notice here about public schools being closed. So we recognize that this contact with people, and we should minimize those types of challenges. So this is how Rolla got the word out that we should avoid these risk factors that might lead to the spread of disease. Okay? Here at the university, there was a nice little story in the local paper. Here we go. Police report that between 40 and 60 men that were sick during the past week are all recovering nicely. You know, I love that. Practically recovered, except 6 who are now in the infirmary. It's reported that those 6 road to recovery. Everything is going swell. You know, so keep that positive attitude from the story. So even here on campus, there was a response and recognition of the outbreak that was going on. Our sister campus up in Columbia canceled football the entire season. They had no football during that season because the recognition, again, of crowds. The university was closed a couple of times during this time period. So the response was to minimize activities that will lead to people gathering in large quantities. In St. Louis was kind of the model for how to deal with this. The political environment in St. Louis was allowed them to take these kind of measures, allowed them to close schools, close activities, prevent all the gathering places. They developed squads from the Red Cross that would deal with the ill people in the community. So St. Louis was kind of held up as a better example for how to deal with these things. I tried to find a little bit more about Kansas City, on the other hand, on the other side of the state. Kansas City didn't handle things so well. The political climate in Kansas City didn't allow those kinds of decisions. The politicians were unable to enact the kinds of rules and regulations that would control the population from gathering in areas. So different cities handle things in very different ways, leading to very dramatic differences in the outcomes. One thing I should note that Missouri actually got off fairly easy during this time period. We were later as far as being impacted by the outbreak. It was mostly the East Coast that was that had a lot of the major impacts as far as the illness and the people that were impacted. We were a little bit later in the flu season, and that's just the nature of the flu, and we'll get to that in a moment here if I don't keep babbling on for too long. Why that's the case? Because the flu virus tends to evolve and change over time, and it tends to weaken as it goes along through the outbreak. So Missouri was quite fortunate, and what's important to note is 2 weeks later, okay. Influenza's on the wane. They were still canceling meetings and what have you, but we're talking about a window of 2 weeks to a month, a very, very short period of time where this disease was having an impact on the community. So the question you might ask is, well, what happened? Why did this happen? Why was this virus so deadly? What can we learn about this? But before I move on to that, do you have any questions about what was happening from a community perspective? How the outbreak is impacting? Yes?
Was the European response a bit more organized, or was it just as disjointed from community to community as it was in the States?
From what I've read, it's the response was probably similar. There, of course, that's where the war was happening on, so it was a lot more factors impacting it. Here, the war impact as far as you know, the movement of troops over there, but as far as I could read, again, I didn't read too deeply into what the European healthcare response was, but from the stories I could see, it didn't seem that different. What was different, we'll get to a little bit, is how it was released in different parts of the country, so or different parts of Europe and how they responded in that sense. So, other questions?
Why was it called Spanish?
Yeah, that's what we'll get to here. Why was it called the Spanish flu? Because I'm going to get to you, where did it come from? And of course, like any good Missourian, we're going to blame Kansas. But the reality is, yeah, Kansas is where it seems to have started. And why why did Spain get blamed? You know, and a lot of it has to do with the question about who had the information, and that's where Spain came involved. Yeah.
So it's October 1918.
Yep.
So what's happening in the war then? Are people coming back? Are Americans coming back yet from the war?
That I don't know. I don't think so. Yeah. So yeah, you know a little bit more about the things. I don't. I doubt it because yeah.
The war is winding down.
Right.
You have all kinds of negotiations. Germany is going through its first revolution. They will have another one in November. So things are winding down, but we're still sending masses of troops over there. They won't be coming home until April.
It's like that. War's never over. There's a lot of stuff.
The war is not winding down. This is November. This is the big offensives
Yeah.
that are now happening.
Right.
This is the big breakthrough offensives
Yeah.
that are happening.
Yeah.
Nobody expected the war to even come to end in 1918. They were expecting the war to continue into 1919, 1920, except that the German major offensive of October, November collapses, leads to our counteroffensive, and that's what breaks the back of everything. So nobody's coming back. Everything's still being
They're
pushed
still there.
to the war.
And I think even once the fighting is done, there's still going to be a lot of cleanup and other stuff that goes on. It's not. No one ever sends everybody back right away.
Okay, so it totally makes sense that we're gonna have the concentrations in the East Coast of cases, right? Because that's where you have mass,
Yeah.
large
That's
populations.
where you set up and then start to set them up.
But does within sort of the Midwest and these other areas where the population is more dispersed, is transportation itself a carrier, right? Like, are there more cases near railways or major thoroughfares or anything like that, or that it's just probably not going to transmit?
I don't think it's that clear cut, to really be able to make those kinds of comparisons. But you see a lot of things that is transportation hubs that tend to be more likely where you see more cases. I think a lot of the stuff said the East Coast issues has to do with all the places where they staged the soldiers and then moving on to Europe and then where they arrived in Europe. That's where you see the concentration. But a lot of that's just also just the sheer numbers of people in those cities. I think is significant. Yeah, David.
I just was taking my ambulance to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
The ambulance system today
Yeah.
is much improved since World War I.
Yeah.
And if you want to find out about the ambulance system back in World War I, go to the State Historic Society and they have pictures of the ambulance that they have. So just check out how the transportation system today compared to then. And there's a much improved.
How we respond and get people to where they need help, and the healthcare systems I mentioned. There's not a lot of physicians. A lot of the real work that happened that really solved things, especially in St. Louis, was the nursing, corps. It's the nurses that really saved the day in most cases, because they're the ones that stepped up and moved in, and despite their risk factors, they were the ones that really took care of the ill, getting the ambulances and getting to where they need to be, and then taking care of them. So the nurses are really the heroes of this time period. So we see that there's also things like Jefferson Barracks was a major site of an outbreak. And again, it was the nursing corps from St. Louis that came down and helped there to keep things from getting out of control. All right. Sure.
So you mentioned that there was a difference in responses between city to city.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean it wasn't considered important enough that the governors put out mandates or National Guard orders, or was it?
There's a lot of it's just it's politics, local politics, and the willingness of politicians to get beyond their whatever their objectives were, and realize that this need to be this is a community issue. And so that's why St. Louis was better, because the politicians there weren't beholden to certain requirements, to communities, and so they were able to make decisions that were unfavorable, closing movie theaters, closing all sorts of different things that people were, that were not going to be popular. Whereas in other cities where those kind of decisions were unpopular, then they suffered the consequences. Okay, couple more. Yeah.
Just as a side note,
Yeah.
because you mentioned the National Guard is not here, the National Guard is federalized, they're over there.
Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I was just kind of curious, was there any attempt for the military to call recruitment or quarantine illicit men from highly infected areas?
There were certainly movements. I mean, you'll see some of the photos I have in here about how they put people in certain sequestered areas. The part of the planning that goes into this as we look for the next possible risk factor. One of the lessons learned is, how do we prepare facilities to minimize those kind of contacts? So the military tried to do those things, but a lot of times you're sick before you realize it, and then you're off somewhere else. But once people were sick, yes, they moved them and tried to isolate them, tried to keep them away from the contact that would spread the disease.
What is the timeline for the European illnesses? Because you've told us
Yeah.
only in America.
Right.
Is the European outbreak ahead of us, during, or later?
Pretty similar time period. Now, it might be within a few weeks, but it's happening all around the same time. What's interesting about this is how it moves from place to place. So I mentioned Missouri was kind of late in the outbreak, in kind of mid to late October. A lot of it started in late September in some parts of the country. But as I said, I'm about to blame Kansas. Back in March, okay? And then it spread east, and then it came back again. So infectious diseases don't spread in a nice uniform pattern like that. They tend to kind of pop around in different places. And so I don't know if we can really pinpoint what that timing was, but it's all happened pretty much
In
simultaneously,
Europe
my
about the
understanding.
same time.
In Europe about the same time, okay? So, all right, so I'm going to kind of move on here, make sure I cover some of the biology that I need to get to here. All right, so what is it about the flu? Flu's been around a long time. Okay? People get sick. We know that. Certain times of year, we know people are going to get the flu. It's been described early, 400 BC, we have some of the early descriptions of the flu. Epidemics, pandemics happen throughout history. In more recent times, from 1957 to 87, there were 20 different epidemics recorded here. So this is something that happens on a fairly regular basis, that we're going to see an increase in the number of cases of the disease. So why was this different? And when I say different, this is what we're looking at. 675,000 Americans died. Okay, that's a pretty accurate number. Some of the other numbers are less precise, but we have, through our records, we have a good idea of how many people in the U.S. died. Death rate 4.3 out of 1,000. It peaked in October. The unique thing about this is, when we think about the flu, the people at risk are the very young and the very old. Okay? The healthy, military age individuals are not going to succumb to the flu. Most people are healthy. In this epidemic, the 20 to 40-year-olds are the ones who died at an extraordinary rate. So there was something different about this disease that we hadn't seen before. So a very odd case. And to illustrate this, the red line, that's those the cases of disease. Here's the age range of those who die. So you look at that red line, you notice that most of the deaths happen in the very young and the very old. Very few in that mid-range where you see people dying. But in that blue line, you notice that we still see the deaths at the extremes, but you also see the significant number of deaths in this middle range, that 20 to 40-year-old age group, which is so atypical. And that's what scared the heck out of people. When all these young, healthy people, these soldiers, are dying, that's just not what we expect to see. Yeah.
On that number that you had for the number of Americans that died from this, is that just strictly flu, or did we have, died from complications?
Complications, I think, is my understanding, is included. A lot of times they died of pneumonia related to that as well. So it's not all. Oftentimes it's not always the flu itself that kills you. It's usually the complications that come along with it. But we did see a lot of people dying just from the flu. Okay. Yes.
How do they define an epidemic?
Yeah, so an epidemic is really any time we see the incidence of an infectious disease rise above what we consider normal. So we track the baseline, and if it moves above the baseline at a certain point. So the terms you'll hear a lot is an epidemic means that something has risen to this point. You'll hear about something called endemic, which basically means something that's around all the time. And that's what the flu is. Flu is an endemic disease. It's always with us. But when an epidemic arises, it's popped up above a certain level. And then what we're talking about here is, though, a pandemic. This is something that happened worldwide. Okay? So those are the terminology that we'll use to describe this. Okay? So that pattern is different. Oops, did I do that right? Okay. And look at the impact it had on life expectancy in 1918. An 11-year drop in life expectancy during the 1918 because of the people that were being killed by this outbreak. So definitely something that was significant and got the attention. We can look back now and say over 25 weeks killed more people than AIDS did in 25 years. Just some numbers to kind of put things in context. Killed more people in a year than the plagues of the Middle Ages killed in a century. And when I do an activity with the local school kids about the Black Death in the 1300s, and talk to them about how the plague basically wiped out a third of the European population. And so, but the sheer numbers are above that. Okay, so pretty impactful. They guesstimate anywhere from 20 to 50 million worldwide died from this influenza outbreak. I've seen estimates as high as 100 million. So truly a global problem. Some examples in New York, the number of children that were orphaned, and again, the number of people died in 1918 flu was 7 times as many as people died in war in the war itself. So the disease killed more people than the fighting did. All right. So how did it become so deadly? How do we learn how these viruses do their thing? So I need to tell you a little bit about the origins of the virus and what we know about viruses. So I got to teach you a little bit about virology. Okay? I brought my viruses along for a little show and tell. If you want to learn more about that. But you'll hear about 3 types of the flu. Yeah. 3 types: influenza A, B, and C. Most of the cases you hear about, if you go to the doctor, you think you have the flu, they're going to test you and see if you have type A or type B. Are the most common type. C we don't see quite as commonly, so it's rarely diagnosed. All 3 can basically cause the same disease. There's just some subtle genetic differences between them. We see type A is interesting because it can infect humans and animals. B is pretty much limited to humans and swine. C is pretty much limited to only humans. And it's usually animals that are the biggest concern when we talk about outbreaks like this. So type A is the one that we're most concerned about, so your flu vaccine is generally going to be against type A strains of the flu. And they're so different that if you get infected with one, it's not going to protect you from the other one. So that's why even if you get a flu shot, which you should get, because no matter what, it's going to help you, but realize that you can still get the flu. Okay? But it's likely to be a strain that's different than what they predicted, and oftentimes it's going to be a much more milder strain, or you're going to have some protection to help you along. Some of the terminology that you're going to see about the influenza virus. So this is what the virus looks like. Nothing like my little critters back there, my cute little things. They don't look nearly as cute as that. But what you're going to see is the things I want you to notice about this virus. So they have these little things on the surfaces that are how they interact with their cells. Think of them as like a lock and key type of mechanism. So this N here is one of the locks that could be used to enter the cell. There's another one called H that serves as another lock to get into the cell. And so both of these keys to get into the locks to get into the cell. So that's the key. How they attach to the cell and be able to get themselves in is by matching that up. So you have to have the right key to get into the right lock to get into your cells. Okay? So those are the important players for how these viruses interact with our cells. The other thing that's very interesting is that they have 8 parts of their chromosomes. So think about us, we have 23 different chromosomes, 2 copies, okay? So that provides us a lot of variation. Viruses have, let's call them 8 chromosomes, okay? They're actually much smaller than a chromosome. Each one of these parts only has one gene. One of these parts will make the H part, one will make the N part, and the other one makes other parts of the virus. So there's a lot of variability that these viruses can go to. I'll get to the significance of this in a little bit, but realize that these guys have 2 keys, and they have 8 genes that they're going to use to control your cells. Yeah.
On the slide before, I believe you said that animals were like a big worry for transport, like
Yeah.
spreading it. Why would that be?
Yeah, I think this is my next slide after this one. Okay. This is why. So we have these H's and N's. Okay. And so there are 16 different types of H's. So 16 different keys that are available. Okay. There are 9 different N's that are available. Okay. And so they can use those keys to get into the right locks. Okay, get into the right types of cells. And so you'll notice here, birds have locks for every one of those keys. So birds can carry any of these viruses. Okay? Other ones, humans are only infected by a handful of these varieties. Swine by a couple of varieties, horses by a couple of varieties. And so animals have common key, locking mechanisms like we have. So a virus that can infect a human that has this H part, the key number 3, they can get in any of these animals. And so if they get into those animals can spread them to us. Does that help answer the question? Okay. So animals are a lot of similarities to how this virus infects us. Okay. So that's the key thing. These are the key players. So when you hear about flu outbreaks, you're going to hear them talk about H1N1, H5N1, all these different things. This is what they're talking about. What proteins do they have on them that allow them to get into your cells? And so they will match to your cells what allows them to get in. All right. So again, the effects of this were unique, that it had this ability to kill young people, it killed quickly, it led to these hemorrhagic systems, this bleeding. So again, what allowed them to do that? We can understand the locks and keys to get into the cells, but once they get into the cell, why do they do so much damage in only this virus and not all the other ones? You know, why doesn't the typical flu have these problems? And so this is where modern science comes into play. So what year was this? Shoot, I forgot to write down the year this was. I think it was around 2000. They actually went to Alaska, where people had died of the influenza in 1918, and of course they were buried in Alaska, so frozen tundra, so the bodies were very well preserved, as well as the virus. So they actually went and exhumed bodies, they recovered the virus from lung tissues, and they actually were able to sequence those genes for the virus and try and figure out why was this virus so deadly. So they were able to get the information. One of the pieces of information was, one of the things being blamed for this outbreak was the pigs. We call it the swine flu. In addition to the Spanish flu, it was also called the swine flu. Okay? But that was a misnomer. Turns out, by knowing the sequence, it actually was a bird flu. Okay? But I'm sure swine were involved in the process, because we'll get back to Kansas in a minute. But they were able to figure out what the organism actually was that was involved in this outbreak. And then we have scientists that do things that scientists will do, is they actually regenerated the virus and tested it in highly secure laboratories. They were actually able to reverse and actually make the 1918 virus, and using very well-controlled conditions, we'll call it biosafety level 4. These are the things, how many of you have seen the Andromeda strain? Okay, or these people living inside bubbles and they're completely covered up. Using laboratories like that, they actually tested the virus and showed that it could kill macaques and produce the same kind of disease that was killing people in this time period. So kind of to verify that it actually got the right virus out of this. Okay? But again, the idea is, why does it do this? Why did it kill all these people? What made it so deadly? And now they have the genes to try and do that kind of investigation. So yeah, I'll skip over this because I'm talking way too long about some of these things. But it's basically producing a special type of immune response. Okay, our immune system responds to the virus, and that's what makes you sick. When you get sick, it's not the actual bug that makes you sick. It's your own body responding to that bug, okay, trying to get rid of it. And this particular bug caused your immune system to overreact. So why do healthy young people do it? Because they have a nice healthy immune system. And so you overstimulate the healthy immune system, you crater. So you go over the top, and that's what kills you. The ones that are not as young, their immune system is quite as strong. A little bit older, their immune system is quite as strong. It's that healthy, young, middle group of individuals that have the strong immune response, that were responding to the genes of this virus that made it deadly. So it's just the perfect storm of the right keys to get into the right cells and the right genes to cause those cells to basically go haywire. That's what was happening and why this disease was so deadly. All right? So now we want to know, where did the virus come from? So the first suspicion is always going to be Asia, because the typical pattern we see for flu viruses tends to be they initiate in Asia and they move across and they tend to then hit North America. So there's certain patterns that flu viruses tend to go. So they looked at Asia. The communities, the culture there was kind of conducive to this type of an outbreak because of the way people raised birds and pigs in close proximity with the family. And so there's a high risk for these viruses to spread. But through their investigations, they weren't able to conclude anything as far as Asia. Asia was kind of removed from this concept. But what about pigs? Why are pigs blamed for this whole process? And what we need to know about these viruses is, as I mentioned, they have those two keys, the H and the N key, and then they have 8 different parts in their sets of genes. So what if an organism gets infected with 2 different types? So they have one virus that has one set of keys, the other virus has another set of keys, and they have different genes inside. If they both get into the same animal, those genes can now mix and match. Okay, so the virus infects the pig, which happens a lot. And then those viruses they put their genes into the pig cells. And then when the pig cells produce new viruses, they don't know these genes go to this one and these genes go to this one. They just say, I need 8 genes, give me any 8 genes. So sometimes it could be the same ones that came originally, or it could be a different combination. And so pigs are a great environment to kind of shuffle the deck and create new viruses. So that's why pigs are often blamed for these kinds of outbreaks. So, oops. Get the wrong. Okay. So that's what happens as far as the role of how this virus happens. Why do we call it the Spanish flu then? This kind of goes back to the press issues. The U.S. press was reluctant to publish negative stories about the war effort, especially in October, because this is short after the Sedition Act, which we heard about at our last presentation. You can't publish anything negative about the war effort. So there was a lot of suppression of the news about the outbreaks because of the negativity that might come from that. But Spain was neutral. They could publish anything they wanted to. They didn't have all these restrictions. So they were the ones that were reporting about the outbreak. So of course, they were the first ones to report that an outbreak was happening. So that's where it started, in the mindset that it was Spain that initiated the process because they're the only ones reporting. So, but we still call it the Spanish flu to this day. In fact, I have a Spanish flu back there on my collection. Okay? I'm missing something here. I skip over. All right, I guess not. Okay, so so back to my point. What are the lessons learned from this outbreak? First of all, they realized from the public health perspective that it's unreasonable to blame individuals, okay, and their circumstances, because this influenza impacted everyone of every social standing. Okay, this wasn't a poor person's disease. It wasn't a worker's disease. This is a disease that infected everybody, and so they suddenly realized, oh, yeah, we're all in the same game together. They realized the need for a centralized public health effort to try and consolidate healthcare, and so the S word is raised a lot. Socialized medicine was really the solution to this thing. This idea of having a national healthcare system where we all shared information and were able to respond to this. And so this is the time you started seeing a lot of these efforts, and the most successful countries in responding were those that had a more socialized healthcare system. Epidemiology, the science of identifying the disease, has been recognized now as a science. John Snow started off with the cholera epidemic in the 1850s, but by this time period we realized, oh, maybe there was something to that, trying to figure out what the source is and see if we can minimize the risks that might come along with this. And then we need to establish a national disease reporting system. So that started off the World Health Organization. So one of the first responses to this was to come up with a national or an international effort based in Vienna. And that was then the precursor to the World Health Organization as a response to what's happening in the world. So I think with that, I think I've talked way too long. I've got some other slides here if you want to ask some questions about the flu, some of the other different kinds of flu outbreaks and how that might play a role. But I guess I neglected my blaming Kansas again. But, yes?
If one suffers from a particular strain of the flu, how long do they have an immunity to that particular strain?
Once you have recovered from that flu, from that particular strain, you will be immune the rest of your life, or at least for an extended period of time.
Okay.
The problem is that strain, the strains are always mixing and matching, so they're always changing. That's why you need a new flu every year, is that you may be immunized against that particular strain, but there's always there's a subtle difference. Even though we have those 16 H's and 9 N's, think about all the different combinations you could make from that, but also realize there are also subtle differences between them that are not always carried possible. So the specific strain, you should be immune for most of your life, but it's unlikely you're going to see the exact same strain again. Yeah.
Were there actually, as a result of centralized public health and all that good stuff, is there actually any determined improvements to battling that, or did that disease, or did it simply die out?
The disease itself, in this case, simply died out. Okay, the response was not sufficient enough. But in response to this recognition of the issue, so we saw certain countries implemented more of these socialized medicines, and so they had a better response to later outbreaks. As I said, the flu outbreaks happen all the time. There's been a number of outbreaks over the decades, some more serious than others, and those countries that responded better were those that had a more centralized healthcare system to kind of nip things in the bud early. Rather than being reactive, they tend to be a little bit more proactive to these types of things. Okay. Yes?
I had seen something where, particularly in Pennsylvania, there was the first huge flood of the disease, and then it died out, and everybody was happy, but then it came back as a second strain.
Well, yeah, and that's I didn't get to that point. So the disease had a second wave in February, March of 1919. So it wasn't over yet in October. So a second wave came. It wasn't nearly as deadly. We didn't see a lot of the same symptoms we saw as the October outbreak, but it did come back again. It was a little bit more widespread, and that was really more in the traditional time period. That's interesting about October is not only the numbers but the timing. October is just not the time that the flu really is that's common to be infectious. The March one was in the more typical flu season, but it was still the levels of the epidemic. But they suspect that it was probably, again, the virus evolves, and so it mutated over time, so it was less deadly as it goes on. I'll talk to my students about a virus that kills you is really dumb. If you're an infectious agent, you don't want to kill your host. Okay, so usually what these are usually novel viruses that are new to that host, and then the virus eventually adapts to that host over time. It evolves, and so they become less deadly over time because it's not what you want to do. So the more deadly ones are things that are new and novel. Is what tends to be more deadly. Yeah.
What makes March like a time for the flu season?
Yeah, so why do we see the flu outbreaks happening around that time of the year? And it's not about getting cold, okay? It's not the cold air that makes you sick. It's the fact that when it's cold outside, what do? You stay inside, right? And you stay in more contact with people. And so there's more contacts with people. There's more susceptibility, so easier to spread. There have been studies, though, that show that humidity can impact those, and so during the winter months the air is drier, and so the virus seems to be more effective at infecting you under under different humidity conditions. So there's been some really cool studies that show that it's multiple factors. A lot of it's just that close spaces, but there are some environmental factors that make that as well. But getting cold, going out without drying your hair is not going to give you the flu. Unless you come in contact with somebody that has the flu virus, you're going to be more susceptible then, because your immune system is also going to be a little bit weaker from all the other factors that are going on there. But if your mother tells you to dry your hair before you go outside, listen to your mother. All right.
So you said they didn't that it was false to blame pigs and things like that.
Mhm.
But was there a particular bird that did help spread it more than any of the others, or was it just a mix of humans transporting themselves?
It's kind of a combination. The way these things tend to work is this virus actually probably came from pigs. And so that's where in the region of Kansas, they think is a region of pig farming. Is a common issue there. But pigs are going to be exposed to the birds, the wild birds there. And so what we suspect happens is that the pigs picked up a bird flu strain. There was a swine strain that they carried, and so they had those two combinations. And then what happened is that the swine then transmitted a bird flu. That normally bird flus, so all those different kinds. Bird flus generally don't infect people. Okay, birds don't usually transmit directly to humans. It usually tends to go through another animal. So the swine were probably the mediator between this process. The most recent bird flu in Asia, 1997, I think was the year. A lot of people died from direct contact with the birds. It wasn't something that could spread from human to human. So bird flus generally don't make it, but they are deadly. Okay, because our bodies are not accustomed to seeing those particular genes from the bird. So the reason why bird flu is deadly is because our bodies have not adapted to what they can deliver. But if a swine adapts the ability to deliver those deadly genes, that's what we're concerned about. And if you want to be scared even more, there was some great work of beautiful science that was done where they tried to recreate, they tried to take the bird flu, the same one, this H5N1 strain that was responsible for the outbreak, and they modified it so that it could more easily be transmitted to humans. And he's like, why on earth would you do something like that? But to study it, to understand how they get and how to develop vaccines and things like that. And interesting, their model organism was a ferret. Humans and ferrets have a fairly similar immune system. And so ferrets are a great model animal for human transmission of viruses. And so they developed a strain of the bird flu that could be easily transmitted to ferrets. And then they studied how that was transmitted. So it's usually an intermediate animal that carries the bird flu to us. So that's why the pigs tend to get blamed for that, and rightly so. I'll say one more. We had a recent flu scare a few years ago that actually turned out to be spread very wide, but it didn't make us very sick. It was a pretty mild one. And again, that was tracked down to some pig farms. I believe it was in Mexico is where they originated that particular outbreak. But again, it's usually the swine that are transmitting it to the humans because they're that intermediary. So, David.
Where was the worst virus in World War I compared to today?
So how would it compare to today? I mean, it's way up there. I mean, we don't see any flu strains that we've encountered in recent years that come close to what this virus could do. So we're very lucky.
One. So today, we're much better controlling virus than in World War I.
No, we're just lucky. That virus can happen at any time. It's just the right combination that could lead to the combination that's going to be. That's why we need to be on alert, and that's why we need to. That was the lesson learned, that we really need to be prepared and monitor what's going on, so that if something starts to pop up, we can respond accordingly. And there's some stories where we've made some tragic mistakes in over-responding to some of these things, but we need to be conscious to what's out there, because again, we don't know what nature can deliver for us. Nature.
Your website was pretty funny what you just said.
Was that? Scare a few people, huh? Yes?
Is it strictly airborne?
Airborne is a challenging term to use to describe the flu because it is airborne, not in the sense of some airborne viruses. It's primarily delivered by droplets that get into the air. So it's generally not something that the flu virus hangs in the air for an extended period of time. Generally, it's the contact with human like droplets. So sneezes and things like that get on you, get on surfaces that you come in contact. So someone with the flu, sneezes on a bench top. You come in and you rub your hands all over the bench top, and then you rub your eyes. That's how it gets delivered. It's not something if you're in the same room as someone that has the flu. Unless you come in contact with droplets, you're not going to get the flu. Measles, on the other hand, that's a classic airborne virus. Someone could be in a room with the measles, they could leave, and hours later, someone could get the measles. Okay, that's how dangerous. So there's a term we call R0 that describes how readily a virus gets spread. Measles in like the 18, so that's the number of people that could be infected from one person. So one person can infect 18 people with the measles. The flu is like around 2 or 3. So we typically transmit to about 2 or 3 other people. So it's not such an easy virus to catch. Yeah.
What do we know about how effective the current vaccine is against the current version of flu strain that's showing up?
Yeah, I haven't seen any numbers on that yet. That's something that I monitor. There's a website I watch called ProMed Mail that I get daily alerts about infectious diseases all over the world. It's hilarious to watch. It's scary. It's scary to see what's going out there in the world. But the same.
Is that your like bedtime reading?
It's hilarious to my family that you read this thing. Through that mail, I've been the first one to see, along with my other million people that are following the same mail. You see when these outbreaks. It's called ProMed Mail. It's basically it's a listserv that will send you notifications about things, and you'll see stuff happening all over the world, which is just fascinating. ProMed Mail, all one word. .com or .org. I don't remember which way it is. Google ProMed Mail and they'll pop up. What was I answering there?
Well, what do we know about the current strain of the flu?
Oh, so that's usually where you see postings about these types of things.
But some people have gotten the flu already, haven't they?
Oh yeah, people have got the flu. It seemed like it was coming a little bit earlier than typical this year, but it hasn't been bad. This has been a pretty mild flu season so far. But until we start seeing the cases pop up, we can't really evaluate what strains are infecting people and how the virus, how the
often do we determine the strain, or is that just done on rare occasion?
It's usually done on people that are hospitalized that get an actual
really
swab done. A lot of times you just diagnose you got the flu. So if that's not monitored, then you wouldn't know. But there's enough cases that are monitored. They want to know that, so there'll be doctors that will help participate in that process to monitor what strains are popping up. So they do keep track of that kind of stuff. Yeah. I forget who had their hand up first. Yeah.
I was wondering, how does a strain get tracked somewhere? I just don't understand how they would do that.
How to track it as far as to identify?
Yeah, where it came from.
Okay. Oh, that's where the science of epidemiology comes from. So you look at these strains and you look at patterns of how diseases come from. So as I mentioned, we can identify that in this time period we didn't know what strains were there. They had to go based purely on the clinical, what doctors were reporting, and so they would report in a certain region that you see this particular type of virus where they had this hemorrhagic disease. That was the real distinguishing character. So they look for outbreaks of this hemorrhagic disease and where they happen, and look for the timing and presentation of the disease. So it's really more of a massive data collection to try and get that. And this was all done in the days before computers, before Cerner could track these kind of things. People were doing this by hand, monitoring that. Okay, this number of cases were happening in this region. That's why Asia was kind of discounted as the source of this, is because they never really saw this type of disease happening until much later in the outbreak. So they unlikely were going to be the source of it. Yes.
Do you happen to know anything about the Hong Kong flu that came through in the early
68?
70s?
Yeah, I think it was
around
68.
70s, yeah.
68, Hong Kong flu. So a lot of the things about flus is we often name them after where they first happened. So Spanish flu, because we think that's where it first happened. Hong Kong flu was identified because that's where the cases first started popping up, and eventually reached the United States later that year. It was a fairly deadly illness, but not to the level of what we saw with the 1918 CDC. In the U.S., about 33,000 people compared to 600,000. So the impact was significantly less, but it was a fairly serious outbreak in that year.
I got it.
Yeah.
I got it.
And if I remember correctly, if you had that flu, you were protected to several other later outbreaks. So they found people that were exposed to the 68 Hong Kong flu had some long-term immunities to some of the pandemic strains that popped up later on. But that's just vague memories in my head.
When you said, it showed the slide where the healthy people, the young ones were dying, did that ever get correlated or compared against, is that related to disproportionate to the military overseas? Or is that disproportionate to the military in general? Or is that just across the board for the whole population?
The whole population of the U.S. for all the people that died during that period, whether they were military and the vast majority were non-military.
Okay.
Because military, they had great health care. They had the doctors. So the people that were really a lot of them were dying from this were the people in the communities that suffered the most from this outbreak. The military helped deliver it because they were traveling all over the world, but the people that suffered the consequences were primarily the community members, and so to my best recollection, we haven't seen a distribution like that since. We've never seen that kind of a distribution where all the people die, or the majority of the people that were dying were in that young. Most outbreaks that happen now are still the classic distributions, the very young and the very old. Yeah.
How quickly can they develop a vaccine? Like if that strain of flu came back, can they develop a vaccine quick enough to help people, or is it?
The technology we have nowadays, it can happen. Remember the stories I've read about this, it's probably a couple of months. The ways that we can grow the virus nowadays, the way we can isolate it, we have technology that we can fairly quickly develop the vaccine. There's some horror stories related to that. Nowadays, I don't have any concerns, but those that can remember the 1976 flu scare, this was initiated because of this concern. 1918 killed a lot of healthy young individuals. So a cadet at Fort Dix died of the flu, and unfortunately they misdiagnosed it. They read it as an H1N1 virus. Turns out it was actually a different virus, the one that died. They were seeing H1N1, which is similar to the Spanish flu. Sorry, I'm using the old terminology. But the one that died didn't have that virus. But that scared people because soldiers are dying. This sounds like the 1980. We better do something. And so they developed a vaccine. Took them, again, a few months, but they didn't properly test it. And so they rushed it to delivery. They distributed 150 million doses throughout the U.S. With very little, investigation of the safety of the vaccine, and we suffered the consequences. That a lot of people, not enough problem here. What was the deaths here? 32 deaths arose from the vaccine from this complication called Guillain-Barré syndrome. Now, the thing to know is Guillain-Barré syndrome is a relatively, I wouldn't say common, but it's the typical severe outcome from some vaccines. But you have to realize that Guillain-Barré syndrome happens with any infection. It's not because of a vaccine, it's because anytime you get an infection and you mount an immune response, you're at risk of Guillain-Barré syndrome. Basically, it's kind of it's like an autoimmune reaction. And so people that get Guillain-Barré syndrome, it's a complication of any infectious disease. And so, so it's not surprising, but this particular case with this vaccine, it was rushed and led to a higher incidence of these cases. And yeah, there's some, if you want to read more about this, read a book called The Coming Plague. It's been mid-'80s. It's a brilliant book about infectious diseases and our responses to them, about the heroes that solved them, but also some of the glaring mistakes we made. Our healthcare system has done some really dumb things. You know, part of that is this instance. Probably the worst thing was how we responded to toxic shock syndrome. You know, so there are sometimes things that we just, you know, yeah, we still haven't gotten past some of those mindsets that are out there. Yeah. Yes.
Is Guillain-Barré syndrome also one of the reasons why we no longer give aspirin to children when they have?
No, that's Rye syndrome.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Rye syndrome is a complication. If you have certain types of infections and you take aspirin, then you have a risk of developing Rye syndrome. What the signs and symptoms of Rye syndrome is, but that's why, yeah, we don't prescribe aspirin anymore, particularly if you have a fever. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
My first landlady close college was born about 1900.
Mm-hmm.
And she told me that at the time that the only antidote they had for the flu was alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they used.
Yeah. Sure.
They stored the alcohol in magazines on military bases because that would be maybe the most vulnerable and it would be there for everybody. She said when they went to the magazines to get the alcohol to treat this epidemic, that they discovered that it had all been siphoned off. None was left.
Interesting.
And so they did not have the one antidote that they counted on to fight it.
Yeah. And it wasn't a very good antidote. It's not. There were a lot of antidotes that were used in that time period that just scared but that's all they had. They tried everything. They tried all sorts of different options to try and recover it. But alcohol reminds me, if I have a moment to tell a story about the Jon Snow and the cholera epidemic. Jon Snow, there's a book called The Ghost Map. If you want to learn more about it, there's a great TED Talk where the author talks about it. So look up The Ghost Map on TEDx. What was interesting about it is that Jon Snow, what he did is he mapped all the people that died of cholera in Soho. And so he looked at all the houses and where people were, and he marked them off, and he made this wonderful map of where people were dying. And like anything else, it's the exceptions that kind of draw you to what's responsible. And so the things that you notice, that people that weren't in the immediate vicinity of the pump were also dying. So why were they dying? And so it turns out, yeah, the Broad Street pump was famous for the cleanest water in London, because you can't see cholera. Okay, the water looks really clean. So family would ship water out to the family in the countryside, or people from another part of the city would go out of their way to get water from that pump. So those people were dying. But the most interesting part of it, there were some people that lived really close to the pump that never got cholera. Okay, and the reason why they never got cholera, 2 blocks away there was a brewery. Okay, and you work at a brewery, what do you drink? Okay, you got beer. Okay, in the Ghost Map, there's an antagonist who becomes a protagonist in the story, and his argument is that, you know, I drink that water and I never got sick. Okay? But how did he drink his water? A little tip of alcohol in his water. He never drank water straight. He always had a little alcohol to it. So, all right.
It's been 100 years.
You're not allowed to ask questions.
Since the Spanish flu.
Yes.
So if it were, you mentioned several things about this already. So if it were to strike today, how good of a job could we muster to fight it off based on new technology? You mentioned that we can come up maybe with a vaccine in a couple months or so.
Yeah.
But
But by the time you do that, it's going to be gone.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the cytokine storm, do we have ways to fight that off? Or?
No, that cytokine storm is responsible for a lot of, toxic shock syndrome is due to a cytokine storm. Something we call endotoxin diseases from systemic infections produce a cytokine storm. That's a standard response. And if you have an endotoxin infection, they've tried to find ways to mediate it. Nothing seems to work. You start a cascade that you just can't stop. So until we come up with a way to mediate that, our challenges are going to be there. Are going to be hard to overcome. I think the best way to treat these things is symptomatic, and so we have excellent healthcare from that perspective. The challenge would be is the isolation of people. Okay, I've gone through. I haven't done this with a class for too long. I really need to get back doing. We did this with the city a few years ago. Did a tabletop exercise. How would we respond to an outbreak like this? We got all people from all parts of the community together. We met in the community center. We all went around. You were assigned different tasks, and we worked through different scenarios and how would you respond to them. Important things like communication, isolation for that. And one of the important things was how do we isolate people, and that was back in the day when we still had the quad. So we would basically close up the quad, and all the people go in the quad. And we don't have that anymore. Now where do we put them? So it's the tricky place is where do you put these people to treat them and isolate them so things don't get spread. So it's something that we need to be planned for, and I would say we probably are woefully under-prepared from that perspective, but fortunately we have excellent health care in general that I think we're not likely to see anything to this extent, but you never know. I'm a real optimist, aren't I? All right. How are we doing time-wise, I think? A little bit over. So, no other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Westenberg. And remember, come back on Thursday for Dr. Larry Gregg. We'll see exactly how the campus here participated in the war effort. We'll find out more about the number of people in Rolla that got sick from the flu. It's going to be great.
All right. Thanks for coming.
Sorry, this is Andrew's office. This is Ethan.